Welcome to Just Settled. On today's episode, we have an incredible guest, Vanessa Vasquez De Lara, an awesome family and divorce lawyer from Miami. Welcome to the show, Vanessa, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
Awesome. So you're telling me a little bit about this case. I definitely want to dive into that. Before we even get started, I kind of wanted to just touch on something that I found out about you and your law firm, which I thought was really cool and amazing. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, and that's your Supreme Scholars Foundation. So before we even get into the whole family law divorce case, if you can kind of tell us just a little bit about what you're doing with that foundation, I think that'd be cool to hear about.
Thank you so much. So my family and I started that 4 years ago when my little brother passed away. And we wanted to make sure that his legacy was something positive versus, the fact that we lost him so soon. So what we do is that we give scholarships to deserving students, not necessarily the kids that are getting all the scholarships, but typically the kids that are a little bit more deserving, but maybe don't come from the backgrounds that would allow them to really excel. So we've actually partnered this year, and we also did it last year, with Big Brother, Big Sister here in Miami. And the ceremony for the scholarships is actually happening now in a few weeks, and we are giving 2 scholarships. One is a full 2-year prepaid Florida legal plan to one student, and another student is receiving $2,000.
That's so cool. That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And anybody that wants to check that out, again, Supreme Scholars Foundation in Miami with Vanessa. So thank you.
And we actually have an event coming up. It's a wine and chocolate event next week, where you get to raise money for a great cause, drink wine, and eat chocolate. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And that's going to be next Wednesday.
Okay. Where's the location on that?
So it's at the Armstrong Jazz House in Coral Gables.
Okay, great. So next Wednesday, what time is it?
It starts at 5.
Cool. Awesome. Well, definitely, if you're around for that, attend. It sounds like an incredible cause and an awesome event. And thank you for sharing that with us, Vanessa.
Of course. Thank you.
So with that, let's kind of dive into this case, which sounds very interesting. You'd mentioned, this was a divorce case client that kind of came to you. If you could just tell us a little bit about how you first found out about this case and how he came, found you, and what your initial thoughts were on the case, anything about that.
Yeah. So the case that I wanted to focus on today is actually a long-term client of my firm's who originally did his first divorce with a different firm and was so dissatisfied when the case was over that he immediately decided to find new counsel. Unfortunately, when he came to us, it was something where the case was very hot and heavy, that initial case. And it kind of seemed like maybe the judge really didn't appreciate the way that he communicated with the court and the way that he expressed himself. So we kind of stepped into a little bit of a hot situation, trying to manage the relationship, not only between our client and his ex, but also between our client and the court. So, that was kind of like how we got involved with this particular client. But the case that we've recently settled is really his second divorce case. That one at least started off on a better foot. He did make sure that he obtained a prenup. As a family attorney, we are so adamant about the fact that every marriage, every successful marriage can really benefit from having a prenup, not because, as people like to say, you're planning for a divorce, but because you are planning for your future. You don't plan to die, but you get life insurance. Sure. You don't plan to get disabled, but you get disability insurance. So you really want to make sure that you are planning for any potential issues down the road by making sure that you have a prenup. So our client did make sure that before he had that second marriage, that he did get that prenup. But unfortunately, the issue that prenups handle is going to be always financial. It's going to deal with alimony. It's going to deal with division of assets. It's going to deal with what's marital and what's non-marital. But what it's not going to deal with is issues relating to any children that you might have together. Yeah. So that's where we end up typically in litigation when we come into cases where there's a prenup. And this case, initially, everything seemed to be going okay. There was some false allegations of violence that we quickly took care of for our client. And the divorce kind of came in and was handled pretty quickly. Okay. Unfortunately, again, something that we see more often than we should. The issue started after the divorce was finalized. And because they have a child in common, the issues kind of started with the child, with the exchanges that, mom didn't want to bring the child to the exchange from the agreement. that mom didn't want to turn over the child, that mom was having all sorts of issues related to their child. And that really creates a lot of tension when the parents are unable to sort of manage their relationship surrounding their child. Although our client was really working hard to make sure that the child is paramount and that, the child's best interests were always being served, that can be difficult when you have a parent that doesn't want to co-parent, that wants to sort of have their way or the highway. And so, as is wont to happen, the case ended up back in court. And what we made sure that we did in the initial divorce agreement is that we included a mediation clause. And we don't always do that, but in certain cases, we find that it's really important to help our clients kind of in that future mind, kind of like how I talked about the prenup, thinking about what if there's issues in the future. Because our client was substantially better off financially, this is the kind of case that really needed to at least have a initial, attempt to resolve the issues by going to mediation. And, and luckily, after 3 times of attending mediation, we were able to finally settle the case.
So in the beginning, when you kind of, again, obviously this was a existing client, right? From his first marriage and the post divorce judgment, I think you said, but this was now his second, his divorce that you were handling in the moment, the second divorce. Were there any concerns or uncertainties that you had about the outcome of it in terms of just how, obviously you're always advocating for your client. What were some of the bigger worries you may have had in terms of how it could play out?
Sure. So the biggest issue in this case is that at the time when these parties divorced, the divorce in and of itself was fairly amicable. They'd had issues that developed during COVID, and their relationship really didn't regain its footing. So the divorce in and of itself was fairly amicable, and the wife actually didn't even bother to hire an attorney for the actual divorce.
Okay.
To now, she got herself a well-heeled partner who perhaps encouraged her in some of the bad behavior that was going on with my client, and ultimately allowed her the finances to be able to hire an extremely litigious law firm on the other side. And apparently, she may have also been told that potentially my client would be on the hook for these attorney's fees. So, the biggest problem that came with this case is that they were literally trying to reopen the initial divorce case by making false allegations about my client's behavior at that time. Since I was the attorney involved in that divorce, obviously that's something that if you're saying that my client did something wrong in the initial case, you're really saying that I did something wrong in the initial case. So that always, kind of raises the temperature of any case whenever you're trying to set aside court orders and allege that there's been fraud by either a party or by their attorney. So the case really started very hot and heavy because of that. And it's always an issue when you allow cases to go to court, because the judge is going to have certain information, but the judge is also going to have a background. They're going to have their biases. They can sometimes be having a good day or a bad day. And, it makes it something where you can never guarantee to your clients, especially in family court, where everything is very, very subjective. You can never guarantee what the results are going to be. So it's always an issue where we really try hard for our clients to be prepared to be able to litigate and go to court, but them having a say in their potential settlement and how things are going to get resolved at the end of the day is really, really paramount and important.
Yeah, it's interesting, just as you mentioned, kind of like the temperature of these cases and how I could imagine they could get so heated and such like emotional investment from both parties. So you touched on some of this, but in terms of like the typical opposition or obstacles that you came across in this case, the stuff that you anticipate, right, that is going to happen, what are kind of some of those touch points? And then was there anything like specifically unique about this case where you were like, oh, this is going to be a little bit different because of this?
So it's rare for us to see, especially, I want to say that the initial divorce was about 2 years ago. I think it was December of 22.
Okay.
So when this case kind of started back up, Florida law is very specific about when cases can be reopened after a divorce has been finalized. And they were trying to allege that it needed to be reopened because the only exception to, it's actually a 1-year rule. The only exception to that rule is the fact that if there is fraud with respect to the financials, then the case is basically unlimited, can be reopened at any point in time in the future. Obviously, it can only go forward if the other side can actually prove the fraud. But that's the tactic that, that these attorneys basically took, is by alleging that there was fraud with respect to the financials. So that's an unusual situation, because you really have to go into it making some very, very strong allegations, which are very difficult to prove, because you're talking about fraud, not just mistake, not just a typo, but literal and actual fraud, in order for them to be able to, to be successful. Second, you're basically upsetting the apple cart. Everything that these parties had resolved, and all of the finances, there was a prenup in place. So even though the allegations were with respect to the finances, they weren't going to be able to redo that. But we felt that, based on the court documents we had received, that they were going to be trying to change all kinds of other things that were completely unrelated to the alleged fraud, that they were going to be trying to change things related to time sharing, things related to vacations and holidays, and any parent who is sort of faced with another parent trying to reduce the time that they get to spend with their child. That's always going to be, a big problem in family law cases. So the tactic that they took is one that we don't see very frequently. And it's sort of a very scorched earth type of tactic in family law, where you're, alleging such malfeasance that you're alleging fraud. Those things kind of change the outlook of the case a little bit, in that sense that we really needed to handle not just responding to those allegations, but also trying to bring the temperature back down and trying to see what we could resolve with our demonstration that, of course, there had been no fraud. So, the things that they were requesting were definitely outside of the realm of what we thought that they could get in court.
Okay. Yeah, the fraud angle is just not something that seems like it comes up often, but I could imagine that's like quite a wrinkle or a monkey wrench or whatever it's called, where they kind of throw something in and you're like, oh, I didn't kind of anticipate this. In terms of the timeline of the case, can you outline that? How long from start to finish did this case run?
So I would say that case was unusually long for a case that really ended up with no court. Because we ended up going to mediation 3 separate times, every time sort of making progress, but not really, getting all the way to a final and global agreement. And I do give kudos to my opposing counsel and to the parties that, despite the type of allegations that were being made, everybody did, sort of put in the effort to kind of keep realizing that we're making progress and we're moving forward. And every good family attorney recognizes that a judge is never going to give you everything you want. So trying to settle, it's always going to be a better outcome. But considering that we had no court, that case lasted, I want to say it was almost a year.
Oh, wow. Okay. And when did you kind of know that a settlement was likely here? Because you mentioned this didn't go to court. You said, I think, 3 separate mediations. When did you know, like, this is going to settle?
I think by the time that we got to the third one, we had a lot of the issues that has sort of arisen in the first and the second mediation. We had kind of been able to work through a lot of them. And we had an amazing mediator, who really kept pushing both sides to recognize, like, listen, this is just not that important to you. You should be willing to give that to the other side, because it's really for the benefit of your child, and it's not something that is affecting you in any way. So that mediator just did such a tremendously good job of making sure, to kind of like keep pushing, keep prodding on both sides to make sure that both sides were sort of giving up as much as they could possibly give up, so both of them could find that middle ground and be able to resolve.
Yeah, and in terms of when you were kind of having that back and forth of that negotiation, how did that process unfold? I'm assuming, obviously their side is always fighting for what they want to get out of it. How did you advocate for your client in this case?
Primarily, I think in the first mediation, there was a little bit of peacocking, maybe, where the other side is kind of like trying to ask for the sun and the moon and the stars. And we see that a lot where, in the beginning of a mediation, kind of like everybody's asking for everything. And it really takes a good, dedicated mediator to help kind of establish those boundaries and kind of like, come on, if you go to court, you're not going to get that. So why are we even asking for that here? Like, that's so far outside the realm of, what's possible or likely that you're just wasting your time here. So that first mediation helped us get to kind of like a good point as to, okay, let's come to everybody needs to come off a little bit on the unreasonable things. By the second mediation, I think we were solidly making progress on the things that everybody could probably agree needed to be changed. And then by the third one, really exchanged all of the financial documents that allowed us to be able to have all the numbers in place, the time sharing and all of the things related to sort of like the child would be able to be sort of resolved at that second mediation. But that kind of, allowed us at the third mediation to kind of finish all of the money things that related to the child, which kind of was like the last frontier that we needed to resolve in order to be able to obtain a global settlement, which a global settlement is always kind of what you're seeking.
Yeah.
Some of our cases, we will agree to resolve with a partial settlement, but we're always pushing to get our clients a global settlement to make sure that everything that is important to them, they're able to get those concessions, and everything that's important to the other side, we can give some concessions. That global settlement allows for that. When you split it up into parts, you can't always get that because typically one side is more invested in specific issues. So when you give up on those, you kind of lose a little bit of the leverage of being able to resolve the things that are important to you.
Okay. And because you're saying global settlement, what kind of was the final outcome on your client's side? Like, how did it help him move forward in his life? I'm assuming obviously he was happy with how this kind of all unfolded, even though it's a difficult, challenging situation. What did that final kind of settlement or outcome look like? How was he able to move forward, and kind of where's everything now?
Sure. So the time sharing, which is what we felt was sort of like a hidden, disguised thing that mom was trying to get, even though all of the allegations are related to the finances. My client did give a little bit on some of the issues that she was seeking. She wanted the child in more activities and more things involving, dad's time. So, so dad gave on some of those things, and mom really came a ways and gave up some of those financial issues that she was really seeking. We were able to resolve all of the fraud allegations, so they won't be able to make any kind of fraud allegations or allegations about the initial case again. So that issue is sort of done, dead, and resolved. Dad agreed to increase a little bit on the support that he was giving mom. So that was kind of the crux of the issue, was related to that fact that, he didn't declare all his income, so the support wasn't where it should have been. We disagreed. But at the end of the day, kind of like the same way that we like to talk about, sometimes money can buy happiness. Sometimes it's worth a little bit to spend a little bit more of that money that ultimately is going to the child anyways, in order to be able to move past some of the difficult things. So my client agreed to pay a little bit more of support in order to make mom happy with the support that she was getting. And he gave her a little bit on, the time that she was seeking. On the other hand, she gave up her claim for attorney's fees, which, since she had hired expensive and litigious attorneys, I'm pretty sure that bill was quite substantial. And she was able to agree that, that she would be solely responsible for that. And we were able to resolve the issues of fraud so that they can't be brought up in the future. So that allows our client to know that, okay, when this agreement was reached, which was in the last few months, that's kind of like resolved, settled, and he doesn't need to worry about anything kind of going backwards. Any issues that might come up will be future facing, but hopefully the fact that he was reasonable in the negotiation and in the settlement will allow mom to sort of think twice before, she ends up going back to court.
Yeah, wow, this was definitely an intense case, and thank you so much for sharing it with us, Vanessa, and thank you for being a guest on the podcast. We hope to have you back here on Just Settled soon. Anybody in Miami who needs an incredible family divorce lawyer, Vanessa Vasquez De Lara, please reach out to her. She will battle for you better than anybody. So thank you for being with us, Vanessa.